The invitation arrived in a cream envelope with gold trim, my name printed in careful calligraphy above the date. Tucked behind the main card was a smaller one, in the same elegant font, so it would look like it belonged there. Suggested contribution for attendance, $10,000. Below that, a note about the registry, and a line thanking guests in advance for helping the couple start their new life without financial stress. I read it twice at my kitchen counter. Then I picked up my phone and texted my son, Marcus, one line. "I'm not coming." He called within the hour, his voice tight with the particular panic of someone who'd assumed a check was simply going to appear the way it always had. What Marcus didn't know, what he'd never once thought to ask in 5 years of watching his life get steadily more comfortable, was that I'd been quietly paying for a version of his success he'd never actually earned. And that night, sitting alone in my kitchen with that price-tagged invitation, I finally opened the folder I should have opened 2 years earlier. My name is Walter Ellison. I'm 66 years old, and this is the story of the year I stopped being my son's silent bank and started asking where exactly all that money had actually gone. What I built and what I gave. I spent 37 years as a commercial insurance adjuster, the unglamorous kind of career that doesn't make for exciting dinner conversation, but pays steadily and rewards a particular kind of patience. The patience to read every line of a contract before you sign it, to notice the clause buried on page 9 that changes what page 1 actually means. I raised Marcus mostly on my own after his mother passed when he was 11. It was just the two of us in a modest house outside Columbus, and I did what I imagine most single fathers do. I worked, I saved, and I made sure my son never once felt the tightness I felt every month balancing our accounts. Marcus grew into a smart, charming young man, genuinely likable in a way that opened doors for him his whole life. He studied marketing, moved to Chicago after college, and met Vanessa about 4 years ago at a mutual friend's engagement party. Vanessa came from money, or at least from a family that presented itself that way. Her father ran a boutique investment firm. Her mother chaired charity committees. And the two of them carried themselves with the particular ease of people who've never once had to check a bank balance before making a purchase. I liked Vanessa in the beginning. She was warm toward me, complimentary, the kind of daughter-in-law to be who remembers your birthday and asks genuine questions about your life. I want to be fair to her here, because this story isn't really about her cruelty. It's about a pattern that grew slowly, quietly, between my son and me, until I could no longer tell where his actual life ended and the life I was secretly funding began. The invitation arrived in a cream envelope with gold trim, my name printed in careful calligraphy above the date. Tucked behind the main card was a smaller one in the same elegant font, so it would look like it belonged there. Suggested contribution for attendance, $10,000. Below that, a note about the registry and a line thanking guests in advance for helping the couple start their new life without financial stress. I read it twice at my kitchen counter. Then I picked up my phone and texted my son, Marcus, one line. "I'm not coming." He called within the hour, his voice tight with the particular panic of someone who'd assumed a check was simply going to appear the way it always had. What Marcus didn't know, what he'd never once thought to ask in 5 years of watching his life get steadily more comfortable, was that I'd been quietly paying for a version of his success he'd never. It began small, the way these things always do. About 3 years ago, Marcus called me sounding embarrassed, explaining that he and Vanessa wanted to move into a nicer apartment in a building closer to her family's social circle, but the deposit and first few months would stretch them thin while Vanessa was between jobs. I sent $8,000 without hesitation. He paid me back the first 2 months, then the payments quietly stopped, and I never brought it up, telling myself it was a loan I was simply choosing not to collect on. Then came the car. Marcus needed something more presentable for client dinners, he said. Something that wouldn't look out of place valet parked outside the restaurants Vanessa's family favored. I covered a down payment on a lease. Then there was a family ski trip to Aspen that Marcus described as basically required if he wanted to stay in Vanessa's father's good graces professionally, since her father had mentioned bringing him into a business venture. I paid for the flights. I want to be honest about why I kept saying yes. Part of it was simple love. A father wanting his son to have opportunities I never had. But part of it, if I'm honest with myself now, was something closer to fear. A quiet worry that if I stopped being useful to Marcus's new life, I'd become less necessary to it entirely. Vanessa's family had a gravity to them, an ease and polish that made my own modest, careful life feel small by comparison. I think some part of me was trying to buy my way into mattering in my son's new world, the same way I suspect Marcus was doing with Vanessa's family in his own way. I have to ask you something, because I think it's the real question underneath a story like this one. Have you ever found yourself quietly funding a life you were never actually invited into, hoping that if you paid enough, generously enough, invisibly enough, you'd eventually earn a permanent seat at the table? That hope is a very specific kind of trap, because the people benefiting from it rarely notice they're benefiting from anything at all. To them, it simply starts to look like how life works. Over the following 2 years, the requests grew larger and more frequent, always framed as temporary, always framed as investments in Marcus's future rather than ongoing support. A wardrobe upgrade before a big client pitch. Membership dues at a golf club where Vanessa's father conducted informal business meetings. A bridge loan when Marcus's marketing firm had a slow quarter, which somehow never quite got bridged back to repayment. I kept a private spreadsheet, force of habit from decades of reading other people's financial documents for a living. And by the time that wedding invitation arrived, the running total sat just over $190,000 over 3 years. Not a single formal loan agreement. Not a single conversation about repayment terms. Just a son who called when he needed something, and a father who kept saying yes because saying no felt like it might cost him more than the money ever did. What I didn't fully understand until much later was how that money was actually being used, or more precisely, how it was being presented. Vanessa's family, and increasingly Vanessa herself, had built a social narrative around Marcus as a rising, self-made young professional, someone whose success reflected well on the family Vanessa was marrying into. The car, the club membership, the wardrobe. All of it got folded into that story as evidence of Marcus's own earning power, his own trajectory, rather than what it actually was. His father's insurance adjuster salary, carefully saved over decades, quietly propactually earned. And that night, sitting alone in my kitchen with that price-tagged invitation, I finally opened the folder I should have opened 2 years earlier. My name is Walter Ellison. I'm 66 years old, and this is the story of the year I stopped being my son's silent bank and started asking where exactly all that money had actually gone. I didn't call Marcus back in anger. I want to explain why, because I think it matters as much as anything else in this story. If I'd confronted him immediately, in the heat of what I'd just discovered, it would have become an argument about my feelings being hurt, easily framed by Vanessa's family, if it ever reached them, as an aging father resentful of his son's success. I didn't want to win an argument. I wanted the actual truth to become undeniable, on its own terms, without me needing to shout it into existence. So I did something quiet instead. I made a list of every ongoing financial commitment I'd taken on in Marcus's name or on his behalf. The golf club membership I was still paying annual dues for. A car lease I remained a co-signer on, and a deposit I'd recently agreed to put down, at Vanessa's mother's request, on a portion of the wedding venue itself, framed to me as helping ensure everything goes smoothly. I hadn't yet paid that final wedding deposit. It was due in 11 days. I called my own financial advisor, a careful, steady woman named Renata Cole, who'd managed my modest portfolio for over a decade, and asked her to help me understand exactly what it would mean, practically, to simply stop. Not to sabotage anything maliciously. I want to be clear, I never wanted to destroy my son's wedding out of spite. I wanted to stop quietly financing a story that had never once included an honest accounting of who was actually paying for it. Renata laid it out plainly. The golf club membership was mine to cancel with 30 days' notice. The car lease co-signature couldn't be removed unilaterally, but I could stop making the monthly payments I'd been quietly covering, which would force the actual financial obligation back onto Marcus's own name, where it had always technically belonged. And the wedding venue deposit, the $10,000 I hadn't yet sent, I simply didn't have to send at all. I want to walk through those 11 days slowly, because the quiet of them mattered more than any dramatic phone call could have. I didn't announce my decision. I simply stopped. I let the golf club's automatic renewal notice sit unanswered. I stopped the automatic transfer covering Marcus's car lease payment. I didn't send the wedding venue deposit. And I waited, not out of cruelty, but because I needed to see, honestly, what would happen to a life that had quietly been resting on a foundation no one but me could see. The calls started within 4 days. First from Marcus, confused and increasingly anxious, asking why the club had flagged his membership for non-payment when he'd assumed, without ever asking, that it was simply handled. Then from Vanessa's mother, Diane, whom I'd met perhaps a dozen times over 3 years, calling me directly for what I realized, with some discomfort, was the very first time. Not to check in, but because the venue had contacted her asking about a missing deposit she'd apparently assumed I would simply continue to cover without ever having discussed it with me directly. I answered Diane's call calmly. I told her honestly that I hadn't been asked to cover that deposit through any actual conversation. It had simply been assumed on my behalf, the way a great deal of financial support had been assumed on my behalf over the past 3 years. There was a long, uncomfortable pause on her end. The particular silence of someone realizing a financial arrangement they'd taken entirely for granted had never actually been formally agreed to at all. By the 8th day, Marcus called me sounding genuinely frightened for the first time in the entire conversation. Not defensive, not annoyed, frightened. He told me the venue was threatening to release their date if the remaining balance, including my deposit, wasn't received within 72 hours. He asked me directly whether I was doing this because of the wedding invitation, because of the price tag. I told him the truth. I told him it had started with the price tag. Yes, because that was the moment the math finally forced me to look honestly at 3 years of numbers I'd been avoiding. But I told him it wasn't really about punishing him for one insensitive line on an invitation. It was about the fact that I'd spent 3 years quietly manufacturing the appearance of a life he'd never once been honest with me, or with Vanessa's family, about actually needing help to sustain. Marcus asked to meet in person, and we sat down together at a diner outside Columbus, the same one we used to visit when he was a teenager and I was raising him alone, back before any of this. He looked exhausted in a way I hadn't seen since he was a kid, overwhelmed by something bigger than himself. He admitted, slowly, painfully, that he'd let Vanessa's family believe a story about his own success that wasn't entirely true, and that somewhere along the way, accepting my help had stopped feeling like receiving support from his father, and started feeling like a resource he was entitled to draw on without needing to explain where it came from or acknowledge it out loud. He said he was ashamed, and I believed him. Because shame, unlike performance, is very hard to fake convincingly across a diner table. I told him something I'd been turning over during those 11 quiet days, that I didn't regret helping him build a life. I regretted that the help had become invisible, unacknowledged, and eventually assumed, to the point where neither of us had ever had an honest conversation about what it actually meant, what it actually cost, and what he actually owed. Not necessarily in money, but in honesty, to me and to the people he was marrying into. I told him I wasn't interested in punishing him by destroying his wedding, but I also told him I wasn't going to quietly resume funding a story that had never once included the truth. If he wanted my continued support going forward, it would need to come with an actual conversation, with Vanessa, with her family, with me, about what was real and what had been quietly manufactured. Not for humiliation, for honesty. Marcus had that conversation with Vanessa 2 days later. I wasn't there, and I've never asked for every detail of it because I think some conversations between two people building a marriage aren't fully mine to know. What I do know is that Vanessa called me herself about a week later. The first time in 3 years she'd ever called me on her own initiative, rather than simply being present when Marcus called. She was more understanding than I expected, and also, to her credit, more honest. She admitted she'd genuinely believed Marcus's income supported the lifestyle they'd been living, that she'd never once thought to question where the club dues or the car payments actually came from. Because in her family, that kind of financial support between generations was simply how things worked, rarely discussed openly. She apologized, somewhat awkwardly, for the price tag on the invitation, explaining that it had been her mother's idea, framed to her as increasingly normal among their social circle, and that she hadn't fully considered how it would land on someone who'd already been quietly supporting them for years. The wedding didn't happen on the original date. The venue released it when the deposit wasn't received in time, and Marcus and Vanessa ultimately postponed by 4 months, choosing a smaller, more modest venue that they paid for largely themselves, With Vanessa taking on freelance consulting work to help cover the difference, and Marcus, for the first time in years, having an honest conversation with his own employer about actually earning a raise rather than quietly leaning on his father's savings to sustain an image of success he hadn't yet built. I attended that smaller wedding 4 months later. No price tag attached. Seated not at the edges of a room performing for people I'd never really been part of, but at the center of a much smaller gathering that felt, for the first time in years, honestly built rather than quietly financed. Marcus and I talk more openly now about money than we ever did before. Not constantly, not awkwardly, but honestly, when it actually matters. I still help him sometimes because he's my son and I love him. But the help is visible now, acknowledged, discussed, rather than simply assumed. Vanessa and I are still building our own relationship. Slower than I once hoped, but built this time on something closer to the truth. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this story, it's this. The kindest thing you can do for someone you love isn't always to keep quietly paying for the life they want to believe they've built. Sometimes it's to let the truth about who's actually holding that life up become visible, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs you a wedding date or a difficult conversation at a diner table. I didn't want to punish my son. I only ever wanted him to build something that was actually his, honestly, even if it meant it looked smaller for a while before it looked real. If this story hit home for you, you're not alone. And there are more like it every week. Subscribe and tell me in the comments. Have you ever quietly funded a life you were never fully part of? I read every single one.